Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the Young Politician Podcast with me, Ralph Farrow. Now today we are joined by the former Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party and the man who attended both Margaret Thatcher and John Major's cabinets. It is of course Lord Peter Lilley. Peter, thank you very much for joining us, really do appreciate it.
I'm enjoying being here.
Thank you for coming. So obviously we know about your long list of achievements in your career, but can you tell us a little bit about your early life and what you did before politics?
Yes, I studied natural science. School specialised in that. Then I went to Cambridge and continued doing natural sciences, particularly physics. Then I did a crash course in economics. And then when I left, did things which combined both a knowledge of scientific and technical subjects and economics. First career was working in developing countries, producing programs for industrialisation and so on in both Africa and Asia, which was fascinating. But I wanted one day to get into politics, and it was a bit difficult to do that from the jungles of Africa or the islands of Southeast Asia. Yeah. So I went into the city, and by happy chance, persuaded a company to make me their energy expert. And I say happy chance because the energy crisis burst a few months later, though I hadn't foreseen it. So it became a hot topic for the next 10 years, and I was ended up partner of the firm, specialising in advising people on investing in the energy business. And that then led to politics.
So what was that natural stepping stone then? You've got to that point of being in energy, and then how did you get to the point of seriously considering a career in politics?
Well, I'd always wanted, since I was in my prime, really, to be involved in politics. But I didn't know it was possible. I rather doubted it. I thought you probably had to have political connections. And my family were modest, middle-class family who had no connection with politics at all. But when I'd left university, I wasn't much involved at Cambridge. I wish I had been now, but I was a bit too shy to speak in the union. When I came down, I saw that others who'd been a bit older than me were already making their names. And I thought, well, if I got involved, perhaps I could too. I joined the Bow Group, which was then a forum for ex-graduates of a Conservative disposition, and eventually became chairman of that in 1973, I think. I was chairman for 2 years. So that gave me a sort of platform to get known, and I got known to Geoffrey Howe initially, who was a former chairman of the Bow Group himself. And he asked me to help write speeches and papers for him. Then he handed me on to Mrs. Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, and I did the same for them, still in opposition. So I was doing that in my spare time, as well as being a partner of this, working for this firm in the city. But when she became leader of the Conservative Party, Mrs. Thatcher came to lunch with our partners. I wasn't then a partner. And afterwards, the senior partner came and said, well, you'll be very flattered, Peter, to know that the Prime Minister asked if we could release you, second you to the research department to work for her and the party. But I'm afraid we had to say no, because we need you as our royal person. But she's very insistent, she wasn't Prime Minister then, she was leader of the opposition. She's very insistent. And she said, well, couldn't we do a deal? Work half for you and half for me, 3.5 days a week for you, 3.5 days a week for me. That was her idea of the working week. And so he said, so I agreed that. And I said, well, you can ask me. I'm happy to come on that. And I've just got married. And if I'm only working half-time for the firm, I'd like to make me a partner. So he went off and talked to the partnership, and they decided both to make me a partner and release me half my time. So I was incredibly lucky. Wow. Except it didn't work out half my time. I worked in the evenings and weekends for the party and during the week for my firm.
Wow, that sounds like an absolutely incredible opportunity that Mrs. Thatcher comes in and almost hand-picks you and says, I want you to work for me. How many times does that happen? So why do you think you chose the Conservative Party then?
Well, as a boy, I was a naturally cantankerous youth, and it was fashionable to be socialist. Most of my school friends were, if they were anything. And I sort of reacted against it. They would say socialism's the natural thing if you avoid all the waste of competition, if you have intelligent and altruistic people guiding the economy, you won't have any unemployment, you'll have efficient businesses and so on. And I wasn't entirely convinced. And then when I went to university, I and a friend hitchhiked across Europe, managed to hitchhike across the Iron Curtain in the back of a lorry to West Berlin, and we're able to see the difference between West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin, both were being absolutely destroyed during the war, but West Berlin was vibrant, prosperous. Even the lowest paid workers were smart and well dressed. Go to the East, and everybody was drab. Buildings were drab. Little had been reconstructed, and that seemed to me to make it pretty clear that capitalism, free markets work, and socialism didn't. Then when I started working, after I left university and was working in developing countries, people would say, oh, well, maybe in developed countries, free markets are a good thing, but in developing countries, you need state to guide it all. And I began to discover that though I was often working for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and it was based on the assumption that each country should develop a particular industry I was looking at. Actually, those industries developed where the governments let them, and they didn't much develop in countries where the country took over. And for the simple reason that people in developing countries, exactly the same as people here, they want to do the best for themselves and their countries. They're prepared to work hard and save, and if they're given the opportunity. But all too often they weren't given the opportunity, often because of aid programs fostering state domination. So that was very interesting and made me think, well, why does it work? Why do free markets and free enterprise and freedom work and socialism and state control not? Even though there's sort of plausible argument to my school friends that if you had very clever, very well-intentioned people running it all, it must be more efficient. And the answer is that it's better to mobilize and harness the energies of millions of individuals collectively are much more intelligent, animated, determined to do the best for themselves and their families than however bright the people running an industry or a government. And so I had to sort of find out why it worked after I found out that it didn't work.
It's an extremely dangerous prospect, I think, when you get into the socialist argument. When you're centralising power in the hands of a few at the top of government, then naturally what you're going to do is attract the wrong people to accumulate the power, and then from that point you're going to see, as we saw in the 20th century, hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions of bodies stacked up as a result of that reprehensible ideology. But after your experience...
That's a very good point. Even if you've got virtuous people running a socialist state, it wouldn't work. But as you said, people are attracted to power, want to control the people, and who are ruthless about doing so. And it invariably works out to be cruel as well as incompetent.
Absolutely, and we saw the consequences of that obviously in the last century, not to be repeated again. But after your experience in Africa and then what you were doing with energy, I believe you stood in the 1984 election in Tottenham.
74.
74, yes. I believe in the second 74 election you stood in Tottenham.
Yeah.
What lessons did you learn from that campaign?
Well, I realised I was never going to win Tottenham. You know, they say I fought Tottenham and Tottenham fought back. It was had always been a left-wing seat and remains so. But it was interesting in that it was already very ethnically sort of separate. There was large Orthodox Jewish community in the south. There was a West Indian community. There were small Asian communities, and there were, by and large, poor white. I sort of moved into the association, a girlfriend who had a car, and most of the members of the association did not have cars. That's why they were still in Tottenham.
Yeah.
They had cars, they moved out. They drive away, you know. And so it was a bit like fighting in New York. You know, I had to go and appeal to the Jewish community, which had always voted left, but was beginning to realise that was a mistake. And there was a signal moment when the Parliament Select Committee on Race Relations decided to do an investigation into the West Indian community in London. Particularly, they took as an example West Indian community in Haringey, which included Tottenham. And they came, and it was all in the newspapers, and they saw extremist, self-appointed leaders of the West Indian, supposed leaders of the West Indian community, Black Power people and so on. And I was furious, and I phoned up the chairman of the Select Committee in Parliament and said, why did you come and see all these people who represent nobody? And you didn't come and see me. I represent the Conservative West Indians, of whom there are lots. And he said over the phone, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Lilley, I didn't realise you were black. And I said, I'm not black. I represent the Conservative West Indians because they're Conservatives. And they vote for me. They don't care what colour I am. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. But as we reached the stage, even then, when people were beginning to think only a West Indian could represent West Indians, only a white man could represent white people, and so on. And that's a terrible path. We progressed down further since then.
Yeah, absolutely right. But if we think about what happened in that campaign, if you think about that time, how did you fight it? And obviously you said about it being a left-wing seat. Do you think there was any chance that you could have won in any hypothetical world?
No, not really.
No.
What I did prove useful in my subsequent seats, I announced that if anybody would invite everybody in the electoral register in their streets, neighbouring street, in for a coffee, I would come and talk to them as the Conservative Chancellor. And I did that. Not many people came, but people did come. And they came as much because they get the invitation would go out from the person living in 13 Acacia Avenue or whatever it was. And they'd say, we're just inviting neighbours in, partly to meet each other and also to meet a Conservative candidate who said he's willing to come. So people came as much to see inside a neighbour's house and meet fellow neighbours as to meet me. But when they got talking, everybody enjoyed it. It was always terribly difficult to get them to go at sort of 11 o'clock at night.
Yes.
And I did the same throughout my career in St Albans and Titch and Harpenden, as often as I could. So that was one thing. It was to try to get people who were not involved in the Conservative Association, who were not Conservatives, but who were just genuinely interested. Right. And too much time is spent by people just talking to their own supporters. It's important to talk to your own supporters and motivate your own supporters, but you've got to get out and meet other people.
And then, obviously, at that point, you lost that election in Tottenham, and you don't stand for a seat until 1983. So what were you doing in those 9 years?
I was doing two things. One, I was trying to get selected for a winnable seat.
Yeah. I
remained on as sort of notionally candidate in Tottenham to help build up the association and so on. And I would put in for seat after seat, either get turned down or get invited for an interview, and I was pretty hopeless at doing the initial interview, which would typically be, they probably invite a dozen or more people for an initial interview, and you'd be talked to half dozen people around a table, and then they choose two or three for the final round. And I never got through to the final round until I'd been doing it for ages, And I was at one, I think it was in Gravesend, and one of the people said, "It says here on your CV that you speak at Hyde Park Tories. How could you make yourself heard in Hyde Park when you speak like you do?" I said, "Well, when I'm in Hyde Park, I speak so loud that if I spoke like that here, you'd fall backwards out of that plate glass window." It's terribly insulting. They didn't invite me back. But I realised from that, they expected you to treat them as if they were a public meeting, whereas I treat them as if they were a committee around a table. So thereafter, I started addressing them in a slightly pompous fashion, and eventually I got invited back for the final round. In fact, the first place I got invited back for the final round, they then cancelled it for various reasons, and the second time was St Albans, and I got selected. So I knew I could do the formal speech to the audience, but I wasn't very good initially at doing the pretending a small audience with a big audience.
So 9 years, that's a lot of time for you to be spending trying to get a seat. So how along the way did you keep that motivation up to make sure that you eventually secured that St Albans seat?
Well, I said I was looking for a seat. I'm bigger. I got married.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well done.
So I got married just before the 79 election, I think. No, just after, or around it. Yeah. Yes, that's right, because I was going to get married. Then my wife the future wife fell ill and was in hospital during the election. Oh, cool. But I was already doing things for the party. I was given this title, consultant, director of research department, when I was simultaneously working for my firm and research department. I was writing speeches for Geoffrey Howe, papers for Mrs. Thatcher, and speeches, and increasingly for Nigel Lawson. So I felt very much in the thick of things. Probably I had more influence then than I did when I was simply a backbencher years later.
So we get to that 1983 point. You've got selected in St Albans. Talk us through that campaign and whether there was a point there where you thought, "I'm actually going to win this."
Well, I was pretty sure I was going to win it. It was, although it was a Liberal target, it was the prime Liberal target seat, I was told, in the South East. My predecessor was a very nice man. Was probably not the right man for the seat in some ways, and the Conservative support was slipping, and in the local authority, the Lib Dems had taken control, the Liberals had taken control of those days. So I had to fight it actively, but in a good year, I should certainly have won it, and I did win it. And I thought I used my house meeting approach across the constituency, so house elders would write to the neighbouring 250 houses and say, "Come and meet your Conservative candidate." And so that got me known at a grassroots level. I did leafleting, and I thought my leaflets were probably more interesting than other people's leaflets. But I fought it in a way a bit like a Lib Dem does now. I fought it at a local level. But I never concealed the fact that I am basically a right-wing Conservative. But, and I remember comparing my position with that of Chris Patten. Mrs. Thatcher's plan had been that I replace Chris Patten at the 79 election because he was going to have to fight Bath. As I got selected for St Albans, that couldn't happen. But in a way, Bath and St Albans are rather similar, lovely cities that attract people who live in lovely cities, who tend to be a bit prone to voting Lib Dem. Otherwise, and Chris Patten fights it by trying to be a sort of Lib Dem. I just fought it as a Conservative, but taking up local issues and arguing Conservative type cases.
And there are many competing theories as to why the Conservative Party won the 1983 election. Some people say it was the Falklands War, other people say it was the improving economic situation. Why do you think you guys won that election?
Well, I don't think it was to the effect that the Falklands War had an impact. It wasn't that people were saying, "Oh, thank you very much, we like the fact that you won a war." They didn't take that view after the Kuwait War, which we also won.
Yeah.
What the Falklands War did was it cemented in people's minds the impression they'd been getting even before the war. And Mrs. Thatcher's initially low level of popularity had begun to recover because people were beginning to say, "We don't quite understand what this woman says about monetarism and controlling inflation and so on. But she seems to believe in something. She seems to know what she's doing. She seems to be determined to do it. And nobody else does." And then when she showed similar determination against the Argentinians, they thought, yeah, she does. And if she can beat the Argentinians, perhaps she can beat inflation and unemployment. So they wanted someone who got that drive, determination, belief, which she preeminently had. And so that helped us in the 83 election by more than we would otherwise have done. But the economy had begun to recover after the 1981 budget.
I think she was helped massively by the hopeless nature of Michael Foot, who obviously it was later on revealed that he was a paid agent of the KGB. So that's a brilliant sign. Well done, Michael. So you get into the Commons in 1983. Tell us about that first experience when you walk through the doors and you think, "My goodness, I can sit on these benches. I can actually have influence." What was that like?
Well, it is an incredible sense. You're in a historic place, surrounded by history. You can almost hear the walls echoing things that have happened past. And I had always hoped I'd get there. I'd a long time probably not believed I ever would, but there I was. So it was a wonderful privilege. I had to learn the ropes. So it was amazing how ignorant I was of many things that now I take for granted. To hear people talk about a minister being a minister of state or secretary of state or an undersecretary and really know the difference between them.
Yeah.
And now I'm amazed that people don't know the difference between them.
Yes.
So things like that. And of course, the rules of the House. I've been there before, and I haven't been when I was. The person I was working for most in the run-up to that election was Nigel Lawson. And I'd been to sort of see him in his room and write things. He'd tell me to write speeches.
Yes. So obviously the first few years after you get into the Commons, you become PPS to Nigel Lawson. What was that like then?
Well, actually, I first became PPS to William Waldegrave and Lord Belwyn, who were both ministers of local government. And that surprised me. I got into the Commons. First thing I'd done, I made my maiden speech. Then there'd been an issue of Mrs. Thatcher, of whether we should increase the amount of money, the own resources the European Union is now called, the money we automatically send to them. A motion had been put down on the order paper, which would never normally be debated, saying we don't want to give any more money to the European Union. And I'd signed it along with 210 other Conservative members. And then Mrs. Thatcher made a concession to the EU and agreed to give them more money in return for other things. And so we were all told, and then the Labour Party, seeing a chance, put down a motion exactly in these words that was to be debated in the House of Commons. And so the whips came around and told us we must all take our names off the order paper and vote the opposite way. And I said, well, I can't do that. My maiden speech, I mentioned all this. I've signed this motion. If I now vote the opposite way, I'll look a complete prune. And so the whip sent me to the deputy chief whip, who's sort of in charge of torture and persuasion. And I remember him saying to you, "Oh, Peter, I gather you're proposing not to do as you're told on this issue." And I said, "Yes, I can't. I'll look a complete criminal." He said, "What a shame. You had such a promising career."
Strange.
Anyway,
Wow.
I didn't do as I was told. And there are only two ways they can discipline you. One is to punish you, put you on boring committees you don't want to go on, don't put you on committees you do want to go on, not promote you and so on. And the other is to promote you, because then you have to behave. So they promoted me. So I was very lucky. I got promoted as PPS to the two local government ministers, who summoned me and said, "Would you like to be our PPS?" I said, "I'd love to, but I don't know anything about local government." They said, "Oh, yes, you do. You and all the other Hertfordshire MPs came in and pleaded for more money for Hertfordshire," which is a sort of annual routine together. When the civil servants explained why it couldn't be done, you argued with them. And you said, no, your figures don't lead to that conclusion. And I said, well, I know a bit about local government, as my wife by then was a local councillor, and I'd had to explain to her how local government finance worked. But I only know sort of about a quarter of it. They said, "That's more than anybody else does." So please be our PPS. So I was for a few months, and then Nigel Lawson, for whom I had worked in opposition, both in opposition and in the early years of his in the previous parliament, asked me if I'd go as PPS, which was an incredible honour, because he's the most senior minister apart from the Prime Minister. I'd sit in on morning meetings with ministers and special advisors and the other PPSs, and you felt we're in the swing of things.
And then your rapid ascendancy continued. You became Economic Secretary to the Treasury, I believe, in June of 1987. Then you became Financial Secretary to the Treasury in July of 1989. For the people at home that perhaps are as ignorant as you were before you entered the Commons, can you tell us what those jobs actually mean and what you did in those jobs?
Well, they were both ministers in the ships in the Treasury. Economic Secretary to the Treasury, I discovered I was responsible for I was responsible for banking and building societies, but also for international monetary relations. I'll come back to that in a moment. So you first of all have to learn to be a minister. I was lucky. I had a very good principal private secretary who had worked for my predecessor, so he knew about how ministers ought to do things, and he was able to tell me. I remember the first day he sort of told me it all. I went into my room and he said, "If you need anything, just pick up this phone. I'm at the other end and I'll deal with it." And after a while, I wanted to know something. I picked up the phone and his voice at the other end said, "Yes, Minister." And for a moment, I thought he was being ironic. But of course, that's how they do. But suddenly I realized I was a minister, and yes, that's how. So you slowly read your way in, you read the papers, you're only a junior minister. Any serious decisions involve the Chancellor until you get enough experience and he can trust you to take decisions. Now, I mentioned that I discovered that I was responsible for international monetary relations. It was known in the newspapers that Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor, was keen on joining the exchange rate mechanism of the European Union, tying our money to the other currencies. And I'd always been in favour of floating exchange rates. I'd always thought Nigel Lawson would be in favour of floating exchange rates. And I did ask him once about this, and I was in awe. He was the cleverest person I've ever worked with. I was in awe of him, and he sort of explained to me how he thought that monetary targets hadn't worked, so we've got to have some kind of discipline, and the best discipline was tie ourselves to the Deutschmark, because the Germans had got monetary targets to work over 20, 30 years, and we would sort of import low inflation. Wasn't entirely convinced, but then I found I was responsible for it, and he was heading in that direction. We never discussed it at morning meetings with all the ministers and so on. That issue was never discussed. Anyway, I said to my officials, what happened? We joined it. And as I fear it doesn't work, can we then leave? Or are you sort of legally treaty bound to remain? And they said, oh, I'm not sure about that. And they went off and wrote a paper, which is what tends to happen when you ask officials things. And this paper came back, but a copy of it was also sent to the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson. So I was summoned by the Chancellor to see him. Look, this is below your pay grade. Above your pay grade. The only people who deal with this issue, myself, the Permanent Secretary, Chief Economic Advisor Terry Burns, and the Prime Minister. Go and deal with other matters.
Wow, okay.
So I didn't, but of course it turned out to be the only question that mattered, because we did have to leave.
Yeah.
At United. Didn't work.
Okay. How much influence did you have then over the budgets? Did you have much influence there?
I certainly didn't as PPS, because I would clear for budget secrets. I wouldn't discuss that with the Chancellor. When I became a minister, I was involved in the budget process and did have, I think, some influence. We would go away to Chevening, the government-owned house normally occupied by the Foreign Secretary, but available sometimes to other ministers for the weekend, and have a budget weekend in January to discuss all the options that were available to us and narrow it down. Certainly I think it was the 1988 budget, that there was an early budget where Nigel cut the top rate of tax from 60% to 40%. And there was a lot of debate in that Chequers meeting, not Chequers meeting, the Chevening meeting, about how low we should cut it. Effectively, officials thought we should do it step by step, so go down from 60 to 50 and then later 40. And my argument was very political, that we have one chance to do this. You wouldn't be able to sort of keep cutting the top rate of tax, because it would be politically controversial. People would say, making the rich richer. And we were going to be able to cut basic rate of income tax as well. So, but we wouldn't necessarily always be able to do that. So we should decide what we want the ultimate rate and go for it straight away. And I think Nigel Lawson sort of agreed with that. And eventually the civil servants sort of gave in. So I had some influence in that sort of way. For specific decisions where I could feel. Oh yes, there was a question about whether we introduce, I think they were initially called PEPs, personal equity things. Anyway, they became ISAs in the end. But the early stage, they were going to be a way of encouraging people to save, particularly in equities. And the question was, what sort of tax relief should there be? And I kept pointing out to the civil servants that it didn't really make any difference whether you get tax relief at the beginning, when people put money in, they could put tax-free money in, as it were, or take money or tax relief at the end when they take it out. Because, as I said, A times B is the same as B times A. And of course, most civil servants can't do mathematics. They didn't. So if A is the fraction that you're left after tax, it doesn't matter whether it's at the beginning or the end. Times B. And eventually they said, oh, we hadn't realized that.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's true. Obviously the principle guiding force was Nigel Lawson.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, he was spearheading, I think, all of these decisions. But one of the people also that you're working with, beside Nigel Lawson, was John Major, of course, because Nigel Lawson left sort of forcibly left in 1989. John Major comes in to replace him. And let me read you a quotation from Anthony Seldon's biography of John Major, which mentions you. He says this, and I quote, "In stark contrast to his often warm and cordial relations with officials, his relations with Treasury ministers were distant. He never became close to Nigel Lawson, nor indeed Norman Lamont or Peter Lilley," close quote. Was that true?
Yes, he certainly didn't become close to me. I mean, perfectly affable. And I'd never thought of that, and I hadn't read that bit of biography. And certainly later on we were less.
Yeah.
I didn't really. I always thought I got on well with him until I read his biography, which he sent me a copy, and I naturally looked up references to myself first, as one does, in a statistical manner, and it was clear from his tone of voice that he found me a bit of a pain.
Yes, well, I think he said that at the time, obviously a word I'm not going to repeat on the podcast, but you were one of three from memory, Peter. You then became Secretary of State for Trade and Industry in July of 1990, right at the tail end of Mrs Thatcher's premiership. What were Margaret Thatcher's cabinet meetings actually like? Because we get this impression that she was the hard-nosed, you do this, you do that woman. What was it actually like from someone at the top table?
Oh, she was very open to argument and discussion. And that I'd learned, when I was working for her part-time, she was in opposition, and then before I got into Parliament. But you had to be able to defend your side of the argument. And she would almost provoke arguments and debate. She would typically, policy was developed in cabinet subcommittees, not in the cabinet itself. But she would come in and say, well, we'll receive the papers. The officials say there are three options, A, B, and C. My view is we should go for C for these reasons, but what do you all think?
Right.
And people were not cowed into silence or to follow her. And she'd go around the table and people would say, A, B, C, There was a famous occasion when Oprah went round the table and everybody disagreed with her option until it got to Nigel Lawson. And there's a convention. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister never disagreed in cabinet before other ministers, because if they do, it's so important that they agree that they not disagree. So, but Margaret Thatcher simply turned to Nigel and said, "Oh, am I the only one that believes in option C?" And Nigel said, "Yes, it would appear so, Prime Minister, but you are not without influence." A typical Lawsonian phrase.
Yes, and obviously during the time when you joined the cabinet, Mrs Thatcher's position was increasingly precarious. Can you talk us through that moment where you realise actually this woman that's been Prime Minister for 11 and a half years is going to fall? And can you talk us through that leadership election?
Yes, it was terrible. I was a root and branch supporter of her. She set up her campaign team under Peter Morrison, who was really not suitable. Drink problem and other problems. And was convinced everything was going swimmingly when it was obvious to the rest of us it wasn't. She went over to Paris, as I recall, for a meeting, an EU meeting of prime ministers. And it was obvious things were going badly. I got a phone call from her office saying, would I draft some stuff for her? She'd have to give a speech in Parliament when she got back. And I said, yes, of course I will, but you must tell her how badly things are going here. She should be back here, glad handing people, promising them the earth. And And it gets in her biography that I asked my office to contact Peter, one of my silent supporters, and he said that things were going dreadfully, giving the impression that I'd said, no, I wouldn't help them all over.
Yeah.
Actually, I did help, and she used a bit of what I used in her speech. By the time she did get back, the results come out, she had not got a majority, or she got a majority, but not a sufficiently large majority there not to be a second round. Mm. She then summoned people in, one by one, from her cabinet to ask them what they would do and whether they would support her. I thought I was the first to be invited in, but apparently I wasn't. I was the second. But I didn't know that. I thought I was the first, and I hadn't spoken to my colleagues about what they were going to say. And actually, I thought that quite a lot of them would tell her, oh, of course, we'll support you, Margaret, terrific, fantastic, and then would vote the other way. But I thought it's important she know just how difficult things were. And I said, I will support you, root and branch, Prime Minister, and I very much hope they'll win. But I have to tell you, I think it's inconceivable you will. Mm. And she was clearly shaken by this. She'd expected me to say lots of comforting things. Mm. And there was a long silence. And then she got the conversation going again, but I explained why I thought that, and obviously I hope she'd been that. But I realised now, but actually most other colleagues told her the same thing. Mm. If I'd known that other people would tell her the bad news, I wouldn't have told her all the bad news quite so brutally myself. Mm. Because it hurt her, I think, coming from me more than it hurt her if it came Clark. So I could see the pain it caused me. I wish to this day I could unsay it and say, well, generally, the outcome would have been the same.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think one of the problems that Mrs. Thatcher had was appointing the wrong people to help her with the leadership campaign at that point? Because we had Ian Dale on a few months ago, and he said that Tim Renton, who was the chief whip at the time, confessed to him many years later that he didn't even vote for Mrs. Thatcher in that first ballot. So do you think that was one of the big problems that Mrs. Thatcher had in winning the first time round, even though she didn't?
Yes. She appointed the wrong people. She went away instead of staying and chatting to people. You know, Michael Heseltine was going around. He wasn't standing in the first ballot, as I call it. It was who was basically, well, yeah. Anyway, he was offering everybody anything, and he was even very nice. He knew that he and I were opposite ends of the cabinet spectrum, but we always got on well with him, and he would say, Peter, you know, it'll be very important that we have a broad cabinet, if Mrs. Thatcher is not re-elected, and someone like you will be important. I'm sure he said that to about 40 people for the 20 places in the cabinet.
Right.
But she should have been doing much the same thing. Probably she would have been lost.
So you get to that point where Mrs. Thatcher decides to resign after not getting sufficient support. And I believe the account is that she is sitting at the head of the cabinet table and she's trying to read out a letter of her resignation, but she keeps sort of crying in between. She has to get one of her colleagues to read it out. Can you recall that extraordinary experience for us?
Yes, but it was obviously one of the most historic, moving moments. But I can't remember it. But when I keep on hearing different accounts of it, I think, oh, what's that? Like that. My recollection is she did start making her statement, which she probably had written down in front of her, and then began to well up. And someone, maybe I can't remember who it was, said, shall I read it for them? But she didn't let that happen. She continued reading it herself. It's my recollection. But it was very painful for her and painful for all of us sharing in her agony.
And then she leaves. Who do you support for the leadership at that point?
Well, then I, Donald Lamont, Michael Howard, and John Gummer, all of whom had been at Cambridge, overlapping, sort of the youngest of the lot, but I'd overlap with the others, went and saw John Major and said, "We are your campaign team. You are going to stand." No doubt he would. Because we were Thatcher. In a way, even John Gummer was a Thatcherite, sort of. And I mean, not that he believed in Thatcherism, but he had supported her. So we wanted to avoid Michael Heseltine winning, and we thought George was the least bad candidate. So we had to support him. We did. He won.
Did he promise you anything for your support?
No.
No.
No, not at all.
No.
I didn't ask or seek him, but it was sort of, I'd been surprised if he didn't. Or else keep me in post, which he did keep me in post.
Yes. So then obviously you get into John Major's cabinet. Now, what was the immediate contrast between his form of cabinet meeting and Margaret Thatcher's?
Well, he too might ask their views, or cabinet committee their views on the subject. But he wouldn't state his initially. Wouldn't say, this is what you got to knock down. He'd say there are options A, B, C. What do you think? Go around the table, and then he'd say, well, the largest body of support is for option B. But there are some people who feel quite strongly in favour of A, and even one or two who really think they ought to opt for option C. And then he'd hand it over to Tony Newton, who's his fixer, who's a man of infinite patience. And he would be deputed to go off and talk to the various dissenting cabinets, taking them line for line through, what if it was a draft bill, white paper or something. Can you agree with the title? Yes, you can agree with it. Then the next line. Can you agree with that? Well, actually, people agree if we move night to May? Okay. So it would take weeks, but eventually the highest common denominator would be reached, and that would be the policy. So you tended to end up with policies which weren't necessarily the most coherent, but had minimised dissent. I much prefer Mrs. Thatcher's way of governing, which was to argue until she was convinced that the right policy was being pursued. But it has to be said in John Major's defence that he had a much more difficult road home in some ways, in that he had a party which had been riven by the defenestration of Mrs. Thatcher, which was divided on the underlying issue of Europe, both at a party level, at a parliamentary level, and within the cabinet. And to handle that was very difficult. You either had to do it the way John Major did, which kept the cabinet together, or maybe he should have, and I sort of vaguely hoped he would say, this is what we should do. Take it or leave it. If you can't agree with it, go away. Now that might, if some people out, you might then have ended up with dissent on the back benches that people, when they leave cabinet, suddenly find minds of their own. But we would have lost crucial votes, because a lot of votes were within one or two on the Maastricht Treaty. So it might not have worked. And maybe what he did was inevitable.
So, whilst John Major was wrestling with those challenges, you were getting on with your own brief. What do you think were the biggest successes and challenges that you had in that job?
Well, initially I was trade and industry and remained at trade and industry until the general election, after which I went. Michael Heseltine was given my old job, and I went to be Secretary of Social Security. It's easier for me to think of successes in social security than anything that remarkable as TTI, except that when I was Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, I was responsible simultaneously for implementing the measures necessary to make Britain part of the single market. And I also had to be involved in negotiating the Uruguay round, the last successful World Trade Treaty covering 125 countries. Go to Brussels and do a lot of negotiating there. And I made very bullish speeches about how both would be fantastic for British exports. Move the internal barriers to trade in the European Union would be particularly good for our exports to Europe, and the halving of tariffs worldwide in the Uruguay round would be good for our trade with the rest of the world. Actually, 25 years later, I was able to look back and see how mistaken I was. Our exports to the European single market in the 25 years leading up to the referendum were stagnated. They grew by less than 1% a year. Contrary, most people assume it was a great success. It wasn't for us. Less than 1% a year. And they grew, whereas our exports to the 111 countries with whom we had no trade deal, that operated simply under World Trade Organization terms, grew 7%.
Wow.
And that taught me three things. One, the single market wasn't of any particular benefit to us. Two, even trade deals with the rest of the world are more influenced by whether the countries are growing or not. 111 countries with whom we had no free trade agreements were growing rapidly, so our trade grew rapidly. They were helped by the reduction in tariffs, but that wasn't the biggest thing. And the third conclusion I reached was what makes your exports in your country grow is not trade deals. They're useful, but it's producing goods and services other people want to buy, getting out and selling them, preferably in large, fast-growing markets, and preferably with the help of an undervalued exchange rate. And that's why years later I was not fussed about us leaving the single market, but I've always believed that what you can do domestically to make your industry more competitive, stronger, is more important than negotiating a trade deal. But I'm not against trade deals, I'm in favour of them. But they're of minor importance.
And I think your fame during the 1990s period didn't come from your time as Social Security Secretary, for example. It came sort of outside of that brief with what you were doing over the Maastricht Treaty. Can you explain to people at home what the Maastricht Treaty actually was and why you were so opposed to it?
Well, the Maastricht Treaty was designed to be a new constitution for Europe, which would transfer more and more competences, as they were called, powers away from individual member states for the decisions to be taken collectively in Europe of a whole range of areas, including energy and so on, and was designed to give a boost to, or to create a single currency, the euro, which in due course everybody would be expected to join. Actually, initially we managed to negotiate and opt out from it, which I think if we hadn't, I would probably have resigned. I did consider resigning. And some junior ministers came and said, look, this Maastricht Treaty is dreadful. If you resign, will join you, and given how few votes are involved, that might make all the difference in being able to defeat it. And so I sat down and thought, if I resign and other people resign, the government will fall, because our majority is 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So if 2 or 3 resign, and if the government falls, then John Smith, and then leader of the Labour Party, will certainly win in the ensuing election, take over, and then we will join the single market. He was committed to joining the single market.
Yeah.
So if I help defeat the government over the Maastricht Treaty, because I don't like one aspect of it, we will get 100% of it. Whereas if I remain there, we might be able to, and we did, opt out of the single currency and the, what's called the employment, and the social protocol, or whatever it is, of the treaty. So, but I remember actually sort of sitting there and trying to write a justification of how I could resign, but tell everybody else they must
stay. Yes, yeah.
There was no logical way I could do that.
Yes, yeah.
I quite wanted to resign. I thought if I resigned over this future, who knows, that might lead to higher things. But I realised that it was irrational for me to resign, tell other people not to. And if other people followed me as they would have done, then the government would fall, and that would be disaster for the country. We would end up in a single currency.
It sounds like a bit of Robert Jenrick type ambition there that you were illustrating to there, Peter, of resigning and then hoping that something bigger would happen in the future.
Well, yes, that's what it was undoubtedly a motive in my mind. I don't know how conscious it was, but looking back, it clearly was. But it was overcome by reason.
Yes. And how did you balance then your loyalty to your values and principles and your loyalty to John Major as the Prime Minister?
Well, as it happened, it didn't need balancing in that respect, because I concluded that I had to support him and what he was doing over Maastricht, which was negotiating these opt-outs, which still left us with an awful lot of stuff we didn't want in the treaty. Yeah. I should explain that when John Major was preparing the grounds for our negotiations of the Maastricht Treaty, the European Commission had sort of spelt out what the areas that they were proposing. And so John Major said to the cabinet, this was one of the rare occasions when policy was formed in the whole cabinet rather than the sub-cabinet, each cabinet minister must go off and consider just the issues that in this draft treaty would affect his department, or their department. And you must rate them A, B, and C. A, we positively want them. B, we don't positively want them, but we can live with them. C, they're unacceptable. So we all went off, and in respect of our own departments, rated things A, B, and C. We came back, went round the table, and at the end of that, I said, Prime Minister, nobody has rated anything A. There is nothing in this draft treaty any of us want. The things we can accept, Bs, and things we can't accept, Cs. And therefore, surely we should be negotiating for the collapse of the treaty. And actually, to his credit, morally, I think, I've misquoted him. I think it was to his credit, and it was to my disadvantage. He came back, and he clearly wasn't prepared for this question, and said, that would be dishonourable. It would be dishonourable to enter into negotiations if your intention is not to achieve something. What's to do with your fellow country and fellow countries. I sort of, and I admired that. I thought, actually, that is a moral approach to it. So let's be honest and people of integrity. But I still sort of feel we should never have entered into negotiations, or if we'd enter into negotiations, negotiate so toughly that they'll be cut fast, rather than going along with as much of it as we could. But anyway, that's what happened. And amazingly enough, I've never seen that in the press, the fact that we entered into these negotiations, although there was nothing in it for us.
Yeah.
Positive.
Yeah. I think part of the reason, as we get up to the 1997 election, part of the reason that public rejected the Conservative Party so heavily was because of perceived divisions in the party and indeed in the cabinet. So do you think the rows that you and perhaps some of your more boisterous colleagues were having with John Major did indeed damage the party in the run-up to that election?
Yes, I mean, we didn't row in public.
Yeah.
I certainly didn't, although I tried to write a resignation speech and found it was logically impossible. I didn't ever read it out anyway. Although I did mention to that the reasons why I wasn't resigning, to persuade others not to do that, junior ministers. So in a sense, there was no secret about that, but it was a reason for supporting John Major. Indeed, there was a time when I was having a meeting, indeed, with some junior ministers. I was explaining to them why I had decided not to resign, and nor should they. We must to support John Major because the alternatives were worse. And afterwards, the Deputy Chief Whip, who was a man of incredible deviousness, was MP for Watford, terribly famous. I just have these blank spots with names. He said to me, came up to me the next time and said, Peter, I should mention, I was walking along the corridor past your room last night, and I lost a cufflink. And while I was on all fours looking for the cufflink, I heard the conversation that went on inside your room. So I heard you were discussing about whether or not people should resign. I said, you doubtlessly therefore heard that I said they should not. That John Major was our man, and we should support it. But it was incredible, this chap pretending that he lost a cufflink. He was actually ear to the door, listening. But I didn't worry, because if he'd heard, I would have been happy to tell every word that had transpired, well, perhaps not some of the adjectives, in that room to John Major, because the conclusion was we got to support him. But anyway, so we didn't disagree with that, but obviously the backbenchers were voting against the government on issues, and that's why the majority was so low. And something like more than half of all backbenchers during the course of that voted against the government on issues connected with Maastricht. So there was huge level of agreement. And that was widely known, and that was, yes, people don't like divided parties, but if there is a division, problem.
And from sort of 1995 onwards, let's say, after you've got the bright new kid on the block, which is Tony Blair, everyone's excited about him, his youthfulness, his supposedly modernising tendency. Did you guys discuss the strategy to go after the Labour Party and Blair? And did you think that despite all of these rows and division, that you could win that 1997 election?
We were in power, I think, for 18 years, weren't we?
Yes, that's right.
And that, it's very rare in any democracy for people to put up any party in government for that long.
Yeah.
So the chances of winning that second election for John Major were very, very small. And I worked on the assumption we wouldn't win. And what did we? Maybe, certainly, if the party had been united or appeared united, it would have done less badly, but it would still have lost. if the electorate hadn't got rid of us then we'd have been a one-party state.
Yeah.
Because the Labour Party promised to effectively not undo the fact that the revolution had. He was promising to maintain it all. Everything was going well. They couldn't get rid of them, and they never got rid of them. You need a change from time to time, and that was the time the country decided to do it.
Yes, I think there would have been serious question marks over the future of the Labour Party if you guys had somehow pulled out the bag and won the 1997 election. It would have been the surprise of the century, I'd imagine. But on that, if we fast forward to that night, the 1997 election, what was it like being, first of all, a Conservative MP that actually retained his seat, and second of all, seeing all your colleagues fall, just drop like flies on that night? That must have been terrible.
It was. My seat had been created out of two other seats, so I wasn't certain what the notional majority I was defending was, but I thought it was pretty large. And I assumed I'd win. By reduced majority, but I assumed I'd win the seat, hold the seat. And then the results started coming through. And I think the first 50 results, there wasn't a single Conservative member of Parliament returned. I lost all those Labour seats with huge increased majorities. And then came the announcement of Michael Portillo's seat in North London, and his majority was bigger than my national majority. I thought, gosh, he's gone. I'm for the chop too. So I went home and wrote out a sort of graceful defeatist speech. It wasn't necessarily going on by 11,000 votes, but it was horrifying just seeing loss after loss and friend after friend after friend party.
And obviously you got into the House of Commons in 1983, so you had no idea what it was like being in opposition. You'd been in government for 14 years at that point. What was it like going into opposition for the first time? Well, it was
certainly a new experience. But interestingly, I got elected in 83 the same time as Tony Blair, and I got to know it. We'd often find ourselves on question time or panel sort of discussions or studios together. And I can remember him saying to me, while he was still, before he became leader, "Oh, Peter, you can't imagine what it's like being in opposition year after year after year. You've always been on the government benches. If we, the Labour Party, don't win next time, I'm going to give up and go back to the law." And a few weeks later, John Smith died. Tony Blair became. I can remember as the news came through, we were all outside the cabinet room waiting for a cabinet committee meeting. People saying, if they choose Blair, we're done for. If they choose Brown, we've got a chance. I think we had a chance even with Brown, but still.
Yes, yeah. And did you, because obviously the way that Blair posed himself was sort of the moderate and sort of a counter to the lefty crazies that were in the past, the militant leftist types. Do you buy the idea that Blair was sort of a moderate, or do you think he was a closet sort of leftist in what he did in government?
No, I think he was a moderate. He did buy quite a lot of the sort of Thatcher isms. He didn't want to denationalise things, got rid of Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution. He, I suppose, had some left of centre leanings, other things being equal. He was quite happy to spend public money, but even then, he pledged to live within the budget set by the outgoing Conservative Chancellor, which I'm sure Conservatives wouldn't have done if they'd been returned. And Gordon Brown too, so it was what he did was, of course, inherit a number of policies from John Smith, including devolution and enthusiasm for human rights, law and so on. So on the constitutional and legal things, again, I'm not quite sure how enthusiastic he was about that, but it gave him something to do and distinguishing between himself and the Conservatives, most of which has been very damaging.
Yeah. And then following that defeat, you decided to run for the Conservative leadership. Why did you do that?
Well, I had decided beforehand to do so, but I'd never given any hint to anyone that I would, because I didn't want to create any more sense of divisions than there already were. Why did I want to? Because doubtless I was vain and thought that I would be a wonderful Prime Minister. I didn't think, and as the course of the leadership election campaign went on, the more I thought about it, less convinced I was that I'd make a good leader of the opposition. Certainly wouldn't be a good leader of the opposition, but fortunately the party realised that before they had to experience it. So I had fairly clear ideas of what to do post Thatcher. I'd written something called Thatcher, the next generation. In fact, I published that just before I got into the cabinet. And quite recently, I went to a talk at the Thatcher Archives, and Thatcher Archivist was on the panel. It was a celebration of Thatcher's 50 years leadership of the Conservative Party. And the archivist of the thing had gone through the various people on the panel and found a copy of my pamphlet annotated by Mrs. Thatcher.
Oh, wow.
Right through from beginning to end, all positively, I hadn't read.
Good.
So almost certainly that played a part in me going into her cabinet. But it meant that I had I'd been thinking about what came next.
So after the unsuccessful attempt at the Conservative leadership, who did you back and where did you want the party to go?
William Hague, who had been my number two at the DSS, and then I'd recommended he go in the cabinet, which he did as Secretary of State for Wales, and he was outstandingly able. It probably was good for the Conservative Party that he was leader, because he maintained morale by fantastic performances at Prime Minister's questions. But it's probably bad for him in that he would have been quite a good Prime Minister if he'd ever sort of remained not having been leader and could have been leader later.
Yeah. And you were appointed Shadow Chancellor and then Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. How did you guys try and rebuild after that defeat, and why do you think it didn't work?
Well, as Deputy Leader, I was given the role of policy renewal, I think is the title. And part of our diagnosis was that we were associated very much with the policies we've been introducing. And we were seen to have solved the major problems that we inherited: the trade unions, inflation, unemployment, nationalised industries. And people thought, well, what have they got to offer us to deal with problems we now face? And the tendency was for the party just to talk about past problems, not about the future problems. So I started this project called Listening to Britain. And the idea was each member of cabinet should go out and meet groups connected with their area of responsibility. If you're health, you would meet nurses. But the point was, you wouldn't talk to them, they would talk to you. And you would say, I want to know what you think are the key problems in your area. We'll have to find solutions to them, but we need to know what the problems are. It didn't work terribly well, because my colleagues would get 100 nurses together and then give them a 20-minute talk. Not sit down and say, "Can you tell me?" But I think it did, in some ways, it discovered when we did talk to nurses and indeed patients, doctors, we found that one of the big problems was hospital-acquired infections, lack of cleanliness in hospitals, things like that. And that led to natural policies to try and deal with it. But, so once you did listen to people, you discover that all sorts of things that mattered to them, which the political class, including our own party, hadn't really latched onto. But the other problem was my colleagues kept on thinking that we were going to people and saying, "What should our policies be?" We had to discover the problems, then we had to work out the policies to resolve them, not say to people, "What would you like our policy to be?" And they generally say, "Higher expenditure and lower tax." You kind of both.
Right. And whilst you were in that position of sort of renewing policy, did you think it was quite difficult to manage the different ideological factions in the Conservative Party, or had that been largely eliminated by the mass exodus of Conservative MPs at the prior election?
It didn't feel difficult, except on the key issue of Europe. That I wanted to say explicitly we would never join the euro. It was vetoed. So we were in a slightly odd position of being against it, but not totally.
I think the position from William Hague was, not for the time being, we're not going to join the euro, which is a bit of a strange position. Not going to do it now, but does that mean you're going to do it in the future? Does it mean not going to do it? And a lot of people, I'd imagine, in the Conservative Party who are on the Eurosceptic side are going to look at that and go, well, that leaves the door open at some point. I'm not happy with that. It's difficult to maintain that position in public. But I can't help seeing the parallels between that time there trying to renew policy and the party after that defeat and now. Do you see any parallels after you were on the front line then between then and now?
There are some, obviously, an even more traumatic defeat after a long period in government. Again, it would have been highly unlikely that one last election, it would have been winning 5 elections in a row, which I don't think has ever been done, though some people say around the end of the 18th century it was. So it was very unlikely we'd win, but again, divisions and some led to it being worse than it, and just the sheer ridiculousness of having 4 or 5 prime ministers in 5 or 6 years made us look absurd, which wasn't something we'd had. A defenestration, which had wounded the party, but hadn't so much discredited it with the public as getting rid of 4 or 5 prime ministers. So it is different this time. Also, this time there is a rival party being established and doing at present well. Though essentially a one-club golfer and a one-man band who's a one-club golfer. So they're strong on immigration, but there are lots of other issues of concern to people, and the Conservative Party's position on immigration is seen to be strong and well argued and well thought out. That will become less of a distinguishing issue. So who knows, we may be able to re-establish ourselves as the natural party of centre-right.
I'm taking it you're not going to be defecting to Reform anytime soon, Peter. Is that the case?
Correct.
No, you're not going to be the next. I'm not going to read about it in the Daily Telegraph that you're the next one that's fallen. No, not the next one. And I must ask you, just before we get to that traditional concluding question, about the situation over the past week with the Conservative Party and a whole array of different defections, most notably, obviously, Robert Jenrick. What do you make of the whole Jenrick situation? Do you think Kemi Badenoch did the right thing in removing him from his position as Shadow Justice Secretary and obviously stripping him of the party membership and the party whip?
Yes, I think she behaved decisively and strongly. And actually, I saw some opinion poll results. Even the majority of Reform supporters were impressed by the way she handled it. As were Labour and Conservatives. So, sheer-handing terms, that was very good, made a very bad situation almost a point of strength. Jenrick was very able, energetic, effective in some ways, and had he been prepared to accept that his natural role was that of Norman Tebbit to Margaret Thatcher, he should have become his Norman Tebbit. But for that, you have to be and be seen to be and be known to be possibly loyal. Didn't make any pretense of being loyal.
And that extraordinary situation where one of his clumsy staffers left, some notes on the side about his resignation letter. You think, what on earth are you doing if you're just that clumsy with all the different things there, and also the deceptive nature of it. I thought that was incredibly strange that he essentially lied to the party leader's face and lied to his colleagues, and then made that extraordinary attack on his colleagues in the speech with Nigel Farage. Do you think then that many commentators are predicting after this point that Reform will essentially destroy the Conservative Party and will become the next government?
Well, I hope not, obviously. My forecasts are little worth, since it's quite clear what I would like to happen, which is the Conservative Party to re-establish itself as the dominant party on the right. What may happen at the next election, if it's less clear who is the dominant party, is that the electors will behave as if there is a pact between Reform and the Conservative Party, even if there isn't. And that's effectively what happened at the last election vis-à-vis Labour and the Lib Dems. There's no formal pact between them, but electors in constituencies where Lib Dems had more councillors than Labour and were more active, voted for Lib Dem to get rid of the Tories, in the south of my old constituency, which was split in two. In constituencies where Labour councillors and Lib Dems, and they appeared more active, the Labour appeared more active, then people voted Labour. And that happened in the north of my own constituency. The electors are far more intelligent than we can give them credit for. So that even in the absence of a pact, they may say in some seats, we think this seat is likely to go Reform, we'll vote Reform, this seat's likely to go Conservative, we'll vote Conservative. That may happen. Or conceivably there may be some more formal pact, depending on how things work. But it may be difficult for that to happen.
Because I think the difference is not really on social issues like immigration or law and order. The difference really comes on economic issues, where Reform seem more comfortable with big state intervention and spending, whereas Kevin Badenoch's trying to carve out a sort of low regulation, low state, low intervention type conservatism. So would you favour that informal or formal pact with Reform?
Well, what I was describing in an informal pact was the total absence of a pact. And at the moment, I find it hard to envisage a pact at all. Partly because there was a unilateral pact, a unilateral decision by Reform to help Boris Johnson. Wasn't even Reform then, was it? Whatever
Brexit
it was called.
I think,
and stand down in a whole range of seats, which they got no thanks. And that was a huge tactical error. There should have been some gratitude for that. And quite apart from gratitude, as a matter of constitutional propriety, Farage should have been made a peer, because he's been, I don't want people to support him. He has been more influential in British politics in the last 25 years than almost anybody else in the House of Lords. So we should have people like that among our numbers.
Because one of the arguments that Farage has been deploying is that Reform are riding high in the polls, which means they should have some form of representation in the House of Lords, obviously outside himself. Do you think that should be the case, that Reform can nominate peers?
Yes, I mean, I don't know all that much about all different routes people can be nominated. I was nominated as a former leading cabinet minister, and that is obviously one route. Whether the HOLAC, the House of Lords Appointments Commission, can itself unilaterally decide to appoint people if on the basis that Farage is arguing, I don't know.
And that brings us now, Peter, to our traditional concluding question. Well, our objective of our traditional concluding question is to ensure that hospitality is really supported in this country. We know since Rachel Reeves's first budget that around 100,000 jobs have been lost in hospitality, a devastating loss to the industry. So can you recall, Peter, some of the best hospitality venues in your former constituencies over the years?
Well, I lived in the village of Offley, just opposite the Green Man, which I can recommend to all your listeners and viewers.
Brilliant.
Though I more often frequented the Red Lion at the other end of the village. Before that, when I lived in St Albans, I lived directly opposite Farrier's Arms, the home that's where the campaign for Real Ale was first founded. And they were great supporters of me. I mean, they didn't necessarily politically support me, but they kept an eye on my house. I wasn't there. But St Albans had the highest proportion of pubs per head of population of any city in the country, because it's distance outside London when people were staging post, and also a place of pilgrimage. So for all those reasons, they had lots of pubs, and I recommend them all.
Yes, recommend them all. That's brilliant. I'm sure plenty of listeners in St Albans will now be hitting the pubs, getting drunk for the evening because of that advice, Peter. So really do appreciate it. It's been just wonderful to have you on the podcast talking about everything related to Conservative politics, your brilliant past, your history with Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and obviously now the challenges that the Conservative Party faces. So thank you very much for coming on, Peter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.